you lose these things. So that was something that possessed me, really, this idea. So in these recent poems, for instance, I see the poem as a score that you can improvise around. Also an idea that, sorry, I'm just babbling on and on. It's, another stream of, you know what it was, actually, Jerry? Jonah Whale allowed me to bring into my poetry many other parts of my life, which had not until then informed my poetry in that strong way. This long-term commitment to Hindustani music, for instance. I grew up in a family that was committed to Hindustani music. But that was one part of my life which I held a bit at bay. This has changed. So again, what is the nature of exposition with a raga? How do gharanas work? How might a bandish be parsed in different ways to present affect? Not only the structure and the purity of what is being said, but also how you weight it with emotion. These are questions I've been wrestling with.
Because yesterday, this is a purely personal remark, and you know, I've heard Ranjit reading poetry for now 25, 30 years. Yeah, 30 years actually. First time I heard him was at, was like a very significant moment. It was reading at the JJ School of Arts, and it was in this beautiful campus. We were reading outside under the trees. It was just really lovely. Arundhati Subramaniam, another close friend, first encounter with her poetry there. Derek Antau reading R. Rajarao's poetry because he couldn't come. Ranjit reading his poetry. And I remember thinking, this is like a bell. Deep sounding like a bell somewhere underwater, moving beautifully with this kind of big rhythm. But yesterday, for the first time, I heard that rhythm being disrupted with other sounds, with exclamatory improvisations, with emotional tonalities, which I had not heard before. Is this also because Jonah Whale allowed you so many more opening outs, that you allowed your reading, which became kind of like a byword? Everyone knew Ranjit's reading. I think, you know, we know Ranjit's reading, we know Arundhati's reading, we know others' reading. We know these three sounds really well. We know exactly how they're coming. But yesterday I was like really surprised and intrigued, and it'll take me some time to get used to it, but it's interesting. Would you like to talk about that? Reading your own poetry and how that has changed?
Partly because of what I said about how we need to work back from print modernity to vocality, to oral culture. But also because I genuinely believe that this idea of the sovereign individual self, which is a gift of a certain kind of liberal philosophy, is truly no longer salient. And I say this in full awareness of the fact that I'm cutting up against this marvelous panel that went before. In certain political contexts, you need to emphasize the sovereignty of an individual self. That's a political struggle. But what this can also do is to offer you a certain narcissism of the self. This follows honestly, from Locke and Mill. Because liberalism, for all its gifts, is also about securing a self that exploits the other. Yeah? Remember that this is when nature begins to be called natural resources, communities become citizens, and the idea of a knowledge to live by is replaced by an expertise. Yeah? And I know all this sounds unimaginably abstract, but all of this is part of the history of the short lyric form, which many of us, particularly in the Anglophone world, take as our basic unit of measurement. Unfortunately, the trouble with the short lyric is that it produces this I, which then goes on and on about, it rabbits on and on about its private anxieties and so on and so forth. In some cases, fabulous. What is loosely called the confessional school has much to offer. But sometimes it's just, as someone said wonderfully yesterday, I think it was you, Pratiti, about it's no different from a certain kind of selfie culture. So to me, it was important to break that form, break with that form. So in the Jonah Whale poems, the short lyric really is twisted and opened up and pushed around. And, you know, it cannot be one voice anymore. Behalfist as this might sound, I do want to include the voices of others in some way. So there's the use of Glisson, who's an important philosopher to me from Martinique. There's one of the poems in Jonah Whale is really, makes extensive use of his writing. It's part of the collage. And Jonah Whale generally is about circulatory histories. It's about the histories of the ocean, maritime histories that we don't usually look at because we're so obsessed with landlocked histories. And that falls into a certain cadence. When you look at the oceans, you have a completely different set of encounters and different languages. And in Ocean, which I just read, I ironically make that point about the scribes writing in languages. The list of languages is a list of languages that technically have no scripts. So that's what I was pushing up against.
So the other set of resources that tends to come up, and we could, if we decided to deal with Ranjit's resources, we'd spend the rest of the day. But I'd like you to talk about the resources of spirit texts, because religion, someone stood up and asked a question about religion in the earlier panel, and I think sometimes we need just to remember that these are also spirit texts, they feed the spirit. So would you like to talk about, Jonah Whale has spirit text in it, and you've often gone back to other religious texts as well, spirit texts as well. So would you like to talk about that encounter?
Well, for one thing, the originary moment of poetry is in shamanism. That's that poetry begins. It's something we might usefully remember. And while I completely agree with Samira and various questioners who decried religion as a patriarchal structure, it undoubtedly is. But there's also within religious experience a different and more emancipatory impulse. And that often cuts up against the patriarchal structure. And this is what you see in Lala's work, for instance. I mean, she was a woman who, ironically, couldn't fit into the Kashmir Shaiva spiritual system because it's based on householders who are teachers, and it's a personal teaching. She couldn't do that, because if she was a householder, she simply had to be a woman doing what patriarchy prescribed. So she goes out into the world, becomes a wanderer, and becomes a quester. So
can we hear some of that wonderful quester's voice right now?
Master, leave these palm leaves and birch barks to parrots who recite the name of God in a cage. Good luck, I say, to those who think they've read the scriptures. The greatest scripture is the one that's playing in my head. It's so much easier to study than act, to philosophize than go looking for the self. Losing the scriptures in the thick fog of my practice, I stumbled on second sight. Those who glow with the light of the self are freed from life even while they live. But fools add knots by the hundred to the tangled net of the world. I mean, and that's a reference to the Jivan Mukta, who is an ideal in Kashmir Shaivism. So you can see how Lala is a quester, in some way independent of the system, but makes a radical and powerful claim on the key ideas of that system.
I thought we would conduct a little experiment in time travel. Since you have Vanishing Acts with you, would you identify the poem that you think is the oldest in Vanishing Acts, and then read the poem in Jonah Whale that is the newest of the poems? So we'll just see whether there's a Ranjit of yore and a Ranjit of more.
Oh my goodness. This would have to be actually the earliest. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This speaks to a way of thinking that I must confess I have now left behind, but that was very important to me as a student. It's called Plum I Fall. Plum I Fall. And it's dedicated to somebody that nobody remembers now, Lin Bao, who is a Chinese dissident. Well, he was a very important part of the establishment and then was proscribed by Chairman Mao. 3 birds glisten on a bark-shorn branch like black plums in rain. They watched you fall that windy day when thunder drove your horses, but the sun in your stomach played you false, stretching its rays, splintered your jade bones. That day, brother, they didn't even squawk. That's how they still glisten on their branch. But that day, brother, when the sun laughed and the thunder laughed, They stared till their plum eyes, swollen with staring, dripped to earth, haven't stopped dripping. Well, we're talking about various things that happen at cosmic and epic scale. This is something that happens in a cafe. It's quite a simple sort of thing. Open for business. Newspaper bunched in hand. You're misting the door with Lysol, wiping the glass panels in wide arcs. But the man in the blue paisley bandana, who's whistling the opening bars of isn't planning to get scrubbed off the menu. He's pushing through with a crate of eggs, his hands itching for whisk and skillet, the first Spanish omelette of the day. He's a dancer sweet-talking the boatman into getting her across the river. You're a tightrope walker with a limp, nursing a sore throat. You spray the swinging air with soap.
The song Saiba Pultori Vetta is boatmen take me across the water, and each time she offers him something else. And the last moment when he finally agrees to take her across the water is when she offers a heart. So it's very nice and heartwarming. And did you notice that there was an old Ranjit reading the first poem with the bell sound under the water? And then there was a new Ranjit who sang in the middle of a poem. It's quite wonderful. Okay. Who's watching, witnessing, sometimes not intervening. You want to talk, I mean, it was interesting to talk about an I, but now let's talk about the they.
There has always been a they, and that's my sense of a majority or a repressive authority or a Greek chorus, if you will, that doesn't intervene. And I think I've always been alert to this, and I never thought there would be a day when I would hark back to my childhood and seek explanations there, because I've always been a little skeptical of that sort of way of doing psychology. But I think it does go back to my school days in Bombay. And there was a real split there, because at home, the atmosphere was playful. It was my parents really, honest. I was born a little late in my parents' marriage, so I don't think they quite knew what to do with a child. So they always treated me as an adult. And so it was.
With far-reaching consequences, I have to say. My picture of Ranjit as a baby is in a three-piece suit.
So it was a playful atmosphere. There was, and nothing was in that sense forbidden. I mean, and all kinds of cultural experiences were present. It was an atmosphere of discussion and so on. And the school was the opposite. It was exceedingly hierarchical. Honestly, I think the school thought it was still in the England of the 19th century. So those were the reflexes. It was very authoritarian. And looking back, I suppose that was my shuttle between two very different worlds. So I ended up either getting marginalized at school or happily marginalizing myself. I used to get myself kicked out of the march past, for instance, things like that, not to the athletics and so on. Yeah, so I kind of retreated into an inner world, but I was always aware of the they, as being the they who are telling you what you should do, shouldn't do, what's not allowed. I was talking about in terms of a commitment to translation. I think translation for me has also been a way to, it's a political act. It's a way of reclaiming things that they tell you isn't part of your heritage. So for me, because again, as I said, part of my background commits me to a cusp between the Iberian, the so-called Hindu, and the Adil Shahi worlds. So the Persian part of this inheritance was always just simply part of my inheritance. So when you're told that this is not Indian, it comes from elsewhere, I rebel against that, I reject that idea. So in recent years, that's taken the form of really engaging with Urdu poetry, with Rekhta, with the Braj poetry that was produced in Mughal times, which no one will tell you about. So this has been my response as a poet to these political questions. So I'm going to read a translation from Bahadur Shah Zafar, which is part of Jora Whale. It's called "The Heart Fixes on Nothing." The heart fixes on nothing in this wasted province. Whoever made anything of a kingdom of shadows, go find another home, my smothered hopes. This stained heart has no roof to offer you. I prayed for long life and got 4 days. 2 were spent in desire, 2 in waiting. Gardener, don't rip these thorns from the garden. They were raised with the roses by a gentle spring. The nightingale doesn't blame the gardener or the hunter. Fate had decided spring would be its cage. Fate's real dupe, that would be you, Zafar. Your body denied 2 yards of spaded earth in the loved one's country. There's a color whose name I've lost, to the ash fleece of cloud, the grackled light of a monsoon sky seesawing in the gaze, unframed, a trap for the sailboat wheeling in the bay. This color that hovers between tenses. Some call it violet, others squeeze their eyes shut when it surges through slate gray folds of water, either not yet or too late, never tame at your heel. But look, the rocks are coming into view, dazed seals resurrected from the waves. The tides worked itself loose of the shore and drifted out. There are no explanatory notes. What's left behind is not the remainder. There's a color whose name I cannot speak. The kiln, the glaze, what you're putting into it. To that extent, as a poet, of course, I'm strongly aware of what I'm making the poem with. Yeah, but that's not over-analysis. And as to personal details, I mean, they're there. They may not be explicit. They may need to, as Jerry just did. I mean, you can tease out and parse those details or the phantoms of events. But I don't write the kind of poetry that is about me as a person. I also don't think that, I'm going to offend everybody. I don't think that that's what poetry is about. It's really not about just your personal angst. I mean, there could well be a kind of poetry that does that at a particular time. But I think I'm going to sound like somebody from the 1950s. The human adventure is really about expanding your own consciousness. And you can't do that if you run back into the small house of your own heart. You really have to open that out.
Thank you, Jerry. How many did you get, Jerry?
I just collected.
That's true.